Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Marcus Delacroix, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023. The cypress trees rose from the black water like the fingers of buried giants, their Spanish moss hanging like funeral shrouds in the humid Louisiana air. I pressed the accelerator of my rented SUV harder, desperate to reach our campsite before full darkness settled over the Atchafalaya Basin. My girlfriend, Sarah, sat beside me, nervously checking her phone for the third time in 10 minutes. "Still nothing," she muttered, holding the device toward the window as if those extra few inches might catch a signal from the nearest cell tower, which was probably 40 miles away in Morgan City. In the back seat, my best friend Tom snored softly, his head lolling against the window. His wife, Jenny, sat beside him, absently stroking the ears of their golden retriever, Bo, who panted in the Louisiana heat despite the air conditioning running full blast. "You sure about this place, Marcus?" Sarah asked, squinting at the GPS display that showed nothing but green emptiness ahead. "The last sign I saw was for some place called Pierre Part, and that was 20 minutes ago." I nodded, though doubt was creeping in like the encroaching darkness. My co-worker Dave swore by it, said Lac des Allemands was perfect for camping, totally isolated, great fishing, and the hunting season doesn't start for another month. I glanced at the handwritten directions Dave had given me, his scrawled writing barely legible in the dashboard light. Should be just another mile or two. The truth was, I needed this trip. The past year had been hell, losing my job at the petrochemical plant, watching my savings dwindle, dealing with my father's slow death from lung cancer. Sarah had been patient, more patient than I deserved, but I could see the strain in her eyes. This weekend was supposed to be our reset, our chance to reconnect away from the suffocating weight of my failures. Tom stirred in the back seat. At 36, he was 2 years older than me but looked younger, his accountant's lifestyle keeping him soft around the middle. He'd been my roommate in college, and despite our different paths, him into comfortable suburban life, me into blue-collar work, we'd stayed close. Jenny, his wife of 8 years, was a kindergarten teacher with endless patience and an infectious laugh that could brighten any room. They'd volunteered for this trip when I mentioned it, probably sensing I needed the support. "There," Sarah said, pointing ahead. "Is that it?" A weathered wooden sign emerged from the gloom. Lac des Allemands, public access. Below it, someone had spray-painted "Stay Out" in red letters that dripped like blood in the headlight beams. "Friendly," Tom mumbled, now fully awake. I turned onto the dirt road, and immediately the SUV began bouncing over ruts and potholes. Spanish moss scraped against the windshield like grasping fingers. The road curved sharply, and suddenly we were driving on a narrow causeway with black water on both sides. In the headlights, I caught glimpses of things moving in that water, alligator eyes reflecting like amber coins, or perhaps just my imagination. After another quarter mile, the road widened into a small clearing beside the lake. It wasn't much, just a bare patch of sandy earth surrounded by cypress trees, with a concrete boat ramp disappearing into the dark water. But it was exactly what Dave had described. "This is it," I announced, trying to inject more enthusiasm into my voice than I felt. We climbed out of the SUV, and immediately the Louisiana night enveloped us like a wet blanket. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of stagnant water, decaying vegetation, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that made my nose wrinkle. Bo whined and pressed close to Jenny's legs. "Jesus, it smells like something died out here," Tom said, waving his hand in front of his face. "Probably just the swamp," I replied, though I'd grown up in Louisiana and had never smelled anything quite like this. Let's get the tents up before we lose the light completely." We worked quickly, setting up our 2 tents, one for Sarah and me, one for Tom and Jenny, while Bo investigated the perimeter of our campsite with obvious reluctance. Every few minutes he'd stop and stare into the dark water, his hackles raised. As we unpacked our gear, I noticed something odd. The clearing looked recently used. There were the remains of an old fire pit, some scattered beer cans, and what looked like the remnants of a larger campsite. But everything had an abandoned feel, as if whoever had been here had left in a hurry. "Look at this," Jenny called from near the tree line. She was crouched beside what appeared to be a child's toy, a small wooden doll with its face carved in an expression of perpetual scream. Who would leave something like this out here? Sarah shuddered. "That's horrible. Just leave it alone." But Jenny, with her teacher's instincts, picked up the doll anyway. The moment her fingers touched the wood, Bo began barking frantically, a sound I'd never heard from the usually gentle dog. The barking echoed across the water and was answered by something else, a long, mournful cry that definitely wasn't human. "Alligator," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Jenny dropped the doll and backed away, but the damage was done. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of our campsite. The smell seemed stronger now, and the darkness pressed closer, as if the light from our flashlights and camp lantern had somehow dimmed. We ate dinner from cans heated over our camp stove. Nobody wanted to risk a fire after hearing that cry, and tried to maintain normal conversation. Tom told stories about his worst clients, Jenny shared funny anecdotes from her classroom, and Sarah talked about her job at the veterinary clinic. But underneath it all was a current of unease that none of us wanted to acknowledge. Around 10 o'clock, as we were cleaning up our dinner dishes, Tom stood and stretched. "I'm going to take Bo for a quick walk before bed," he announced. "Don't go far," Jenny warned, "and take a flashlight." "Yes, Mom," Tom replied with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. They disappeared into the darkness beyond our small circle of light, Bo's collar jingling as they walked. We could hear Tom's voice for a few minutes, the one-sided conversation people have with their dogs, and then silence. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. "Where are they?" Jenny asked, checking her watch for the 3rd time. "Probably just doing his business," Sarah said, but her voice carried the same worry I was feeling. At the 40-minute mark, Jenny stood up. "Something's wrong. Tom never takes this long, and Bo always comes running when I call." She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted into the darkness, "Tom, Bo, come here, boy." Her voice echoed across the water and was swallowed by the night. No response. I grabbed the most powerful flashlight we had and stood up. "I'll go find them. They probably just got turned around in the dark." "I'm coming with you," Jenny said immediately. "No, you and Sarah stay here. Keep the lantern burning so we can find our way back." I set off in the direction Tom had gone, following what looked like a game trail that led away from the lake and deeper into the swamp. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a tunnel of vegetation that seemed to close in behind me as I walked. "Tom," I called. "Bo." Nothing but the sound of my own footsteps squelching in the muddy ground and the distant splash of something large moving through water. After 10 minutes of walking, I found Bo. The dog was sitting perfectly still beside the trail, his golden fur matted with something dark. His eyes reflected my flashlight beam, but there was something wrong with them. They looked glassy, unfocused. He didn't react when I called his name or even when I approached him. "Bo, where's Tom, boy?" The dog's head turned toward me with mechanical precision, and I saw that his muzzle was stained with what looked like blood. But it was his expression that made my skin crawl. The usual intelligence and warmth in his eyes had been replaced by something cold and hungry. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, taking a step back. That's when I heard Tom's voice, though it took me a moment to locate the source. It was coming from above me, somewhere in the canopy of the massive cypress tree that loomed over the trail. "Marcus," Tom called, his voice oddly flat and emotionless. "Up here." I aimed my flashlight upward and nearly dropped it in shock. Tom was about 15 feet up in the tree, sitting on a thick branch with his legs dangling. But he was sitting wrong. Too straight, too still, like a marionette waiting for someone to pull its strings. "Tom, what the hell are you doing up there? Jenny's worried sick." "Come up here, Marcus," he replied in that same monotone voice. "You need to see this." "Come down. Are you hurt?" Instead of answering, Tom began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle but quickly escalated into hysterical, uncontrolled laughter that echoed through the swamp like the cry we'd heard earlier. The sound made my blood run cold because it didn't sound like Tom at all. It was too high, too wild, too inhuman. Below the tree, Bo suddenly stood and began walking toward me with that same mechanical movement. His eyes never left mine, and I could see now that his mouth was stretched in what looked like a grin, revealing teeth stained dark with blood. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled back toward the campsite. Behind me, Tom's laughter followed, growing louder and more deranged with each passing second. I burst into our camp circle, gasping and bleeding from a dozen scratches. "Where's Tom?" Jenny asked immediately, jumping to her feet. "Where's Bo?" "Something's wrong," I panted, trying to catch my breath. They're not right. We need to leave, now." "What do you mean they're not right?" Sarah demanded. Before I could answer, we heard footsteps approaching through the darkness. Slow, measured footsteps, accompanied by the familiar jingle of Bo's collar. "Tom?" Jenny called hopefully. The footsteps stopped just outside our circle of light. For a long moment, there was silence except for the sound of our own breathing and the distant sounds of the swamp. Then Tom stepped into the light. He looked exactly the same. Same clothes, same face, same build. But something fundamental had changed. His expression was completely blank, his eyes focused on something we couldn't see. There was mud in his hair and dark stains on his shirt that looked suspiciously like blood. "Hey, guys," he said in a voice that was almost his, but not quite, like someone doing a poor impression of Tom. "Sorry I was gone so long." Jenny ran to him, relief flooding her face. "Tom, I was so worried. Where's Bo?" "He's fine," Tom replied, still in that flat, emotionless tone. "He's right here." Bo padded into the light behind Tom, moving with that same mechanical gait I'd observed earlier. The dog's fur was cleaner now. Someone or something had washed away the blood, but his eyes still held that glassy, predatory gleam. Jenny knelt down to pet Bo, but the dog didn't react to her touch the way he normally would. Instead, he stood rigid, his gaze fixed on something in the darkness beyond our camp. "Tom," I said carefully, "what happened out there? You were gone for over an hour." Tom's head turned toward me with the same mechanical precision I'd seen in Bo. "We got lost," he said, "but we found our way back." "You were laughing," I continued, watching his face for any sign of recognition. "Up in that tree. You were laughing like a maniac." For just a moment, something flickered in Tom's eyes, a flash of confusion, maybe even fear. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "I don't remember laughing," he said. Sarah moved closer to me, her hand finding mine. I could feel her trembling. She'd sensed it too. Whatever was standing in our campsite wearing Tom's face wasn't entirely Tom anymore. "We should get some sleep," not Tom said, his mouth stretching into a smile that was too wide and held too long. "Big day tomorrow." He walked to his tent with that same mechanical gait, unzipped it, and disappeared inside. A moment later, we heard the sound of him settling into his sleeping bag. Jenny looked confused and hurt. "He didn't even say good night," she whispered. "Tom always says good night." Bo followed Tom into the tent, and soon we could hear the dog settling down as well. Everything seemed normal, except for the fact that nothing felt normal at all. "We're leaving," I whispered to Sarah and Jenny. "First thing in the morning. We're packing up and getting out of here." "But what about Tom?" Jenny asked. "And Bo?" They're acting so strange." "That's exactly why we need to leave," I replied. "Something happened to them out there, and I don't think it's safe to stay." We agreed to take shifts watching the camp through the night. I took the first watch while Sarah and Jenny tried to sleep in their tent. I sat beside the dying camp lantern, my flashlight in one hand and Tom's hunting knife in the other, listening to the sounds of the night. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement from Tom and Jenny's tent. The zipper opened slowly, and Tom's head emerged. In the dim light, I could see his eyes scanning the campsite before settling on me. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, his voice still carrying that flat, emotionless quality. "Just making sure everything's okay," I replied, gripping the knife tighter. "Everything's fine, Marcus," he said, and there was something almost hypnotic about the way he said it. "Everything's perfect now." He emerged fully from the tent, and I could see that he was fully dressed. Behind him, Beau's eyes glowed in the darkness of the tent interior, watching me with that same unsettling intensity. "You should sleep," Not Tom continued, taking a step toward me. "You look tired." "I'm fine," I said, standing up and putting some distance between us. "You're scared," he observed, tilting his head like a curious animal. "Why are you scared, Marcus?" The question hung in the air between us. "Because you're not Tom," I wanted to say. "Because whatever you are, you're wearing my best friend's face, and I can see the thing that's looking out through his eyes, and it's hungry." Instead, I said, "Just being cautious. Strange place, you know." "Yes," he agreed, still smiling that too wide smile. "Very strange." He stood there for another minute, just watching me, before finally returning to his tent. But I noticed he didn't zip it up completely, leaving a gap just wide enough for those glowing eyes to keep watching me through the night. At dawn, I woke Sarah and Jenny and quietly explained that we needed to pack immediately and leave. Jenny protested. She was still convinced that Tom was just tired or maybe sick from something he'd eaten. But Sarah backed me up. She'd seen the way not Tom had looked at me during our midnight conversation. We packed our gear as quietly as possible, but as we were loading the SUV, Tom emerged from his tent. In the morning light, he looked more like himself, and for a moment I wondered if I'd overreacted. Maybe he really had just gotten lost and disoriented in the swamp. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of its old warmth. "Yeah, I remembered I have to work on Monday," I lied. "Sorry to cut the trip short." "That's too bad," he said, and there was genuine disappointment in his voice. I was really starting to like it here. Jenny emerged from the tent, looking relieved to see her husband acting more normally. "Are you feeling better, honey? You were acting so strange last night." "I feel great," Tom replied, wrapping his arms around her. "Better than I have in years. Maybe we should stay another night." "No," I said quickly. "We really need to get back." Tom's eyes met mine over Jenny's shoulder, and for a moment I saw something that made my blood freeze. It was intelligence, ancient and malevolent, studying me like a scientist might study a lab rat. "Of course," he said finally. "Whatever you think is best, Marcus." The drive back to civilization was tense. Tom sat in the passenger seat beside me, making normal conversation about work and football and all the things we usually talked about. But every so often I'd catch him staring at me in the rearview mirror with that same calculating expression, and I'd see Beau in the back seat doing the same thing. Jenny seemed oblivious to the change in her husband, chatting happily about planning their next camping trip. Sarah, however, kept giving me worried looks and had moved as far from Tom as possible in the back seat. We stopped for gas in Morgan City, and while Tom was in the bathroom, I pulled Sarah aside. "Something's wrong with him," I whispered urgently. "That's not Tom. Not entirely." "What do you mean?" she asked, though I could see in her eyes that she'd noticed it too. "I don't know. But whatever happened to him out there in the swamp, he came back different. Changed." "You think he's sick? Maybe we should take him to a hospital." Before I could answer, Tom emerged from the gas station, Beau trotting beside him. As they approached, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. They were walking in perfect synchronization, their steps matching exactly. "Ready to go?" Tom asked with that too-wide smile. We drove the rest of the way to New Orleans in relative silence. When we reached Tom and Jenny's house in Metairie, I helped them unload their gear, trying to act normal while my mind raced with possibilities. Maybe whatever had happened would wear off. Maybe Tom would be himself again after a good night's sleep in his own bed. "Thanks for organizing the trip, Marcus," Tom said as we shook hands goodbye. His grip was firm, normal, but his skin felt cold despite the warm evening. "Yeah, sure," I replied, eager to get away. "We should do it again soon," he continued, his eyes boring into mine. "Real soon." Sarah and I drove to my apartment in silence. It wasn't until we were inside with the door locked behind us that either of us spoke. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice shaky, "what happened out there?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever it was, I don't think Tom came back with us." Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Tom called twice, sounding completely normal, asking about work and making plans to watch the Saints game on Sunday. Jenny posted cheerful photos on social media of her and Tom gardening in their backyard, Bo lying contentedly in the grass. But there were small things that bothered me. In one photo, I noticed that Bo's shadow fell in the wrong direction compared to Tom and Jenny's shadows. In another, Tom's reflection in their kitchen window seemed to show a different expression than the one on his actual face. The breaking point came a week later, when I received a call from Jenny's school. "Mr. Delacroix?" the voice on the phone said. "This is Principal Martinez at Oakwood Elementary. I'm calling because Mrs. Boudreau didn't show up for work today, and she's not answering her phone. Since you're listed as an emergency contact, I wondered if you knew where she might be." My blood turned to ice. Jenny never missed work without calling, and she definitely would never just disappear without explanation. I drove to their house immediately, Sarah insisting on coming with me despite my protests. The house looked normal from the outside, mailbox empty, newspaper collected, lawn recently mowed. But when I rang the doorbell, there was no answer. "Their car's in the driveway," Sarah observed. "They should be home." I tried calling Tom's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Using the spare key I knew they kept under a flower pot, I led us into the house. Everything looked normal at first glance, TV on, coffee cups in the sink, Jenny's purse on the kitchen counter. But the silence was absolute. No sound of footsteps, no conversation, no barking from Bo. "Tom?" I called. "Jenny?" Nothing. We searched the first floor, then climbed the stairs to check the bedrooms. That's where we found them. Tom and Jenny were in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of their bed, facing the door as if they'd been waiting for us. Their eyes were open but completely blank, staring at nothing. Neither of them moved or acknowledged our presence in any way. Bo sat at their feet in the same catatonic state, his tongue lolling out slightly. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered, backing toward the door. "What's wrong with them?" I approached Tom cautiously. "Tom, can you hear me?" No response. I waved my hand in front of his face, but his eyes didn't track the movement. It was like looking at three mannequins arranged in a grotesque tableau. That's when I noticed the smell. The same organic, decay-like odor we'd encountered at the campsite, but stronger now. And underneath it, something else. Something that smelled like sulfur and old meat. On the nightstand beside the bed, I spotted something that made my heart stop. The wooden doll Jenny had found at the campsite. It was sitting upright, its carved scream face pointed directly at the three motionless figures. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now." But before we could move, all three of them, Tom, Jenny, and Bo, turned their heads toward us in perfect unison. Their blank expressions didn't change, but their mouths opened simultaneously, and a sound emerged that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It started as a low moan, like wind through a tunnel, but quickly escalated into a shriek that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than their throats. The sound was so loud and piercing that Sarah and I both clapped our hands over our ears, but it didn't help. The shriek seemed to bypass our ears entirely and resonate in our bones. And in that shriek, I heard voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all screaming in agony and despair. Men, women, children, all crying out in languages I didn't recognize, begging for help that would never come. The three figures on the bed began to stand, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets controlled by an inexperienced hand. Their eyes never left ours, and their mouths continued to emit that horrible shriek. Sarah and I ran. We crashed down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until we reached my SUV. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. Behind us, the shrieking continued, growing louder and more intense until I was sure it would shatter every window in the neighborhood. As we drove away, I looked back to see three figures standing in the upstairs window, perfectly still, watching us leave. I called the police from a payphone outside a convenience store, telling them I was worried about my friends who hadn't shown up for work. When the officers arrived at the house an hour later, they found nothing. No Tom, no Jenny, no Bo. The house was empty, as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. The official report stated that the family had apparently left town suddenly, possibly due to financial or personal problems. Their bank accounts had been emptied. Their car was found abandoned at the New Orleans airport, and there were no signs of foul play. But I knew better. I knew they were still out there, somewhere in the Atchafalaya Basin, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to stumble into their territory. Because whatever had taken Tom and Jenny and Bo wasn't finished with them, it was using them as bait, lures to draw in fresh victims. I tried to warn people. I posted on camping forums, contacted park services, even called Dave at work to tell him never to recommend that campsite again. But who was going to believe a story about supernatural possession in a Louisiana swamp? Sarah and I lasted another month before she left. She couldn't handle the nightmares, the paranoia, the way I'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She said I'd become obsessed, that I needed professional help. Maybe she was right. But 3 months later, I saw a news report about a group of college students who'd gone missing during a camping trip in the Atchafalaya Basin. Their abandoned campsite was found near Lac des Allemands, their gear scattered as if they'd left in a hurry. The only trace of them was a cell phone video, found partially buried in the mud, that showed something moving in the trees beyond their campfire. I recognized the location immediately. It was our campsite, the same clearing where our nightmare had begun. In the video, just before it cuts off, you can hear voices calling out from the darkness. Familiar voices, offering help, promising safety, luring the students deeper into the swamp. Tom's voice, Jenny's voice, and the excited barking of a golden retriever named Bo. They're still out there, still hunting, still adding to their collection of empty shells, walking through the world wearing human faces. And someday, when enough time has passed and people have forgotten about the missing college students, they'll move on to a new hunting ground, a new lake, a new campsite, a new group of friends looking for a weekend escape from their ordinary lives. I've moved to Colorado now, as far from Louisiana swamps as I can get. I don't camp anymore. Don't even like being outdoors after dark. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that shriek echoing across the mountains, the sound of dozens of voices crying out in eternal anguish, and somewhere among them, the laughter of my best friend Tom, who found something hungry in the darkness and brought it home. The wooden doll is gone from Tom and Jenny's house, but I know it's not destroyed. It's out there somewhere, waiting in another campsite, ready to be picked up by another curious soul who doesn't understand that some things are better left alone. And if you ever find yourself camping near Lac des Allemands, and you hear friendly voices calling out from the darkness, offering help, or asking you to come see something wonderful, don't listen, don't follow, just run. My name is Marcus Thibodeau, and I am 32 years old. This happened in October 2023. The morning we set out for the Atchafalaya Basin, I should have paid attention to the way my dog Boudreaux kept whining at the truck's tailgate. Should have listened when he refused to jump up into the bed like he always did. Instead, I chalked it up to excitement and lifted his 70-pound frame myself, ignoring the way his hackles stayed raised even after we'd been driving for an hour. "Easy there, boy," I called back to him through the rear window as we turned off Highway 190 onto the narrow dirt road that would take us deep into the swamp. "Just gonna be you, me, and Tommy for a few days. Nothing to worry about." Tommy Bergeron sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone with increasing frustration. We'd been friends since high school, but life had pulled us in different directions. Him to his accounting job in Baton Rouge, me to the oil rigs in the Gulf. This camping trip was supposed to reconnect us, get us back to the simple things we'd loved as kids exploring the backwaters around Plaquemine. "Still no signal," Tommy muttered, holding his phone up toward the canopy of cypress and tupelo that was growing thicker with each mile. "How far out are we going exactly?" "Far enough that nobody's going to bother us," I said, navigating around a pothole that could have swallowed a small car. "Remember that spot Papa used to take us? Near Bloody Bayou? Found it on some old maps. There's supposed to be solid ground about 2 miles in where we can set up camp." Tommy made a face. "Bloody Bayou? Christ, Marcus, couldn't we have picked somewhere with a less ominous name?" I laughed, but it sounded forced even to my own ears. The deeper we went, the more the October light seemed to dim, filtered through Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds from every branch. It's just a name. Man, probably got it from all the red clay runoff during spring flooding. But I knew the real story. Papa had told it to me when I was 12, the same age he'd been when his own grandfather shared it with him. Back in the 1800s, a family called the Boudoir had lived out here, if you could call what they did living. They'd prey on travelers, hunters, anyone foolish enough to venture into their territory. The locals eventually formed a hunting party, tracked them down, and dealt with them the way people dealt with rabid animals. The bayou ran red for days afterward, or so the story went. Just folklore, though. Had to be. We parked at the end of the road, where the dirt track simply vanished into standing water and tangled roots. I'd brought my pirogue, a narrow flat-bottom boat Papa had carved by hand decades ago. It would be tight with all our gear, but it was the only way to reach the camping spot I'd scouted on satellite maps. Loading the boat took longer than expected. Boudreaux refused to get in at first, standing at the water's edge and whimpering in a way I'd never heard from him before. He was a Louisiana Catahoula, bred for hunting wild boar in terrain exactly like this, but he acted like he'd never seen swamp water in his life. "What's gotten into him?" Tommy asked, shouldering his backpack. He'd bought all new gear for this trip, expensive stuff from REI that still had the tags on it. Made me feel a bit sheepish about my ancient canvas tent and patched sleeping bag, but that equipment had served me well on dozens of hunting and camping trips. "Don't know," I admitted, finally coaxing Boudreaux into the bow with a strip of jerky. "Maybe he smells a gator nearby." The pirogue cut through the dark water with barely a whisper. I'd grown up navigating these channels, reading the subtle signs that distinguished a deep channel from a shallow bar, solid ground from floating bog. Tommy sat rigid in the middle, gripping the gunnels with white knuckles every time a cypress knee scraped against the hull. "How do you know where you're going?" he asked. "Everything looks the same out here." It did, to an outsider. Miles of dark water broken by islands of higher ground, each one choked with the same dense vegetation. But I could read the landscape like a book. The way certain trees grew only in specific soil conditions. How the water flowed in patterns that revealed the underlying topography. The almost imperceptible differences in the bird calls that indicated whether we were entering or leaving a territory. "See that dead cypress there? The one split by lightning?" I pointed with my paddle. "And the way the water gets clearer where it curves around that mud bar? Papa taught me to navigate by markers like that. Every bayou has its own personality once you learn to read it." We paddled for over an hour. The only sounds our quiet conversation, the gentle splash of paddles, and the occasional plop of a turtle sliding off a log. Boudreaux had calmed down once we got moving, though he kept his ears pricked and his nose twitching at scents I couldn't detect. The camping spot exceeded my expectations. A roughly circular patch of solid ground, maybe 40 yards across, surrounded by water on 3 sides and connected to a slightly higher ridge by a narrow strip of land. Ancient live oaks provided natural windbreaks, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed in the barely perceptible breeze. It felt isolated without being claustrophobic, private without being trapped. "This is perfect," Tommy said as we beached the pirogue. "How did your grandfather even find this place?" "He never said exactly, just that he'd been coming here since he was a boy, and his daddy before him." I started unloading our gear, noting how Boudreaux immediately began marking territory around the campsite's perimeter. Said the hunting was always good here. Deer, duck, even bear if you knew where to look. We made camp with the easy efficiency of 2 people who'd done this together countless times as teenagers. Tommy's fancy new tent went up faster than my old canvas one, but mine would shed rain better if the weather turned. I strung a tarp between 2 trees for our cooking area while Tommy gathered wood for the fire ring I'd started building. "Jesus, look at this," Tommy called from the edge of our little island. He was standing near a massive cypress, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter. "There are marks carved in this tree." I walked over to look. Deep gouges in the bark, old enough that the tree had started healing around them, but recent enough that they hadn't been completely grown over. They formed symbols I didn't recognize, angular, deliberate cuts that definitely weren't natural damage. "Probably just hunters marking territory," I said, though something about the marks made my skin crawl. "You know how people carve their initials and stuff? These don't look like initials." Tommy traced one of the symbols with his finger. "They look almost ritualistic." I was about to respond when Boudreaux started barking. Not his usual alert bark, but a deep, sustained howling that raised the hair on my arms. He was standing at the water's edge, staring across the bayou at seemingly nothing. "Easy, boy," I called, but he ignored me completely. His hackles were raised again, his body rigid with tension as he continued that unnerving howl. "What's he barking at?" Tommy asked. I strained my eyes in the direction Boudreaux was looking. The opposite shore was perhaps 50 yards away, thick with palmetto and young cypress. As I watched, I could have sworn I saw movement, a shadow that seemed too large and too purposeful to be just wind-blown vegetation. "Probably just a deer," I said, but I kept watching that spot even as I walked over to calm Boudreaux. "Come on, boy. Whatever it is, it's not bothering us over here." The dog finally stopped barking but remained alert, his gaze fixed on that distant shore. I managed to coax him back to the campsite with more jerky, but he ate it without enthusiasm, his attention constantly drifting back to the water. "This place gives me the creeps," Tommy admitted as we got our fire going. "It's too quiet. Where are all the birds?" Now that he mentioned it, I realized he was right. The swamp should have been alive with sound. Birds calling, insects humming, the splash of fish jumping. Instead, there was an oppressive silence broken only by the crackle of our fire and the occasional rustle of Spanish moss. "Probably just the time of day," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "They'll be more active around dawn and dusk." We cooked dinner over the fire. Nothing fancy, just beans and rice with some andouille sausage I'd brought from home. The familiar routine helped settle our nerves, and by the time we'd eaten and cleaned up, the silence didn't seem quite as ominous. "Remember that time we camped at False River and you swore you saw a ghost?" Tommy asked, settling back against a log with a beer in his hand. "I did see something," I protested. "White figure walking along the shore around midnight." "It was a great blue heron, Marcus. We figured that out the next morning when we saw it fishing in the same spot." I laughed, feeling some of the day's tension ease. "Yeah, well, at least I didn't scream like a little girl and wake up half the campground." I was startled. Tommy's indignation was only half serious. You try having something that tall suddenly appear 20 feet from your tent. We shared stories and jokes as the sun set, painting the swamp in shades of orange and red that reflected off the still water like flames. Boudreaux had finally relaxed, curled up near the fire with his head on his paws, though I noticed he still lifted his ears at every small sound. By the time full darkness fell, we were both feeling better about our choice of campsite. The fire provided a circle of warmth and light that pushed back the oppressive atmosphere of the swamp. We talked about work, about mutual friends who'd gotten married or moved away, about our plans for the weekend. "I needed this," Tommy said as we banked the fire for the night. "Been so caught up in work lately, I forgot what it felt like to just exist without schedules and deadlines and all that bullshit." "That's what this place is for," I agreed. Papa always said the swamp was where a man could remember who he really was, underneath all the noise of civilization. We were settling into our tents when the first scream echoed across the water. It was human, definitely human, but distorted by distance and the strange acoustics of the swamp. A cry of pure terror and agony that seemed to go on forever before cutting off abruptly. "What the hell was that?" Tommy's voice was tight with fear. I was already unzipping my tent, grabbing the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag. "I don't know. Sounded like it came from across the bayou." Boudreaux was on his feet, every muscle tense as he stared into the darkness. His lips were pulled back in a silent snarl, and I could see the whites of his eyes in the firelight. Should we go check it out?" Tommy asked, though he made no move to leave his tent. I played my flashlight beam across the water, but it barely penetrated 20 feet into the darkness. Whatever had made that sound was well beyond the reach of our light. "With what?" I asked. "We'd have to take the pirogue, and I'm not navigating these channels in the dark. Too easy to get turned around or stuck on a stump." Another scream split the night, closer this time and definitely from a different direction. This one was higher pitched, more desperate, and it was joined by other sounds, thrashing in the underbrush, the splash of something large moving through water. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered. "There's more than one person out there." I wanted to believe it was some kind of animal, gators fighting over territory maybe, or wild boar being taken by a predator. But those sounds were too organized, too purposeful. They spoke of intelligence, of intent. "Could be hunters," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Tommy. "Maybe somebody got hurt and they're trying to help." But even as I said it, I knew it was bullshit. No hunter would be out here in the dark, and certainly not in groups large enough to make the kind of noise we were hearing. A third scream from yet another direction, and this time I caught something that made my blood run cold. In the brief silence that followed, I heard laughter, low, guttural chuckling that carried clearly across the water. "We need to get out of here," Tommy said. "Right now." "And go where?" I kept my voice level, but inside, I was fighting panic. "We're 2 miles from the truck, in the middle of a swamp, in complete darkness. We wouldn't make it 100 yards before we hit a stump or got lost. So, what do we do?" I looked around our small camp, calculating our options. The fire was burning low, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. Our supplies were scattered around the campsite: food, cooking gear, sleeping bags, everything we'd need if we had to hunker down and wait for daylight. "We wait," I said finally. "Keep the fire going, stay alert, and wait for dawn. Then we pack up and get the hell out of here." But even as I said it, I was remembering Papa's stories about the Boudoir family, about the way they'd hunted people like animals in these very waters. Just folklore, I'd always told myself. Local legends to scare children. Now, listening to those sounds echoing through the darkness, I wasn't so sure. We spent the next few hours feeding the fire and taking turns on watch. The screaming came at irregular intervals, sometimes close enough that we could hear individual words mixed in with the terror, sometimes so distant they seemed like echoes of nightmares. Always from different directions, always followed by that horrible laughter. Around midnight, Boudreaux started growling. It was a low, continuous rumble that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. He was facing the narrow strip of land that connected our island to the higher ground beyond, the only way someone could approach without a boat. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, playing my flashlight beam along the tree line. At first, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the light's reach, movement. A figure stepping from behind a tree, then quickly disappearing behind another. Too quick to make out details, but tall and pale and definitely human. "Did you see that?" Tommy's voice was barely audible. "Yeah." I kept the light trained on the spot where the figure had vanished. Someone's out there. Should we call out? Maybe they need help. Every instinct I had screamed against that idea. No, if they needed help, they would have called out already. They're watching us. For the next hour, we played a deadly game of hide-and-seek with whoever was in the tree line. Glimpses of movement, the occasional crack of a twig, the sense of being observed by hostile eyes. Boudreaux never stopped growling, his gaze tracking movements I couldn't see. Then the sounds from across the water stopped completely. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the screaming had been. It felt expectant, predatory, like the moment before a trap springs shut. "Where did they go?" Tommy whispered. I didn't answer because I was pretty sure I knew. They weren't across the water anymore. They were coming here. The first sign was Boudreaux's behavior. His growling intensified, and he began moving around the perimeter of our camp in an agitated circle. His hackles were standing straight up, and saliva dripped from his bared fangs. Then I heard the splash. Subtle at first, the kind of sound a large fish might make jumping. But it came again and again, in a rhythm too regular to be natural. Something was moving through the water toward our island. "Tommy," I said quietly, "get the camp hatchet and that big kitchen knife." "What are you going to do?" "Whatever I have to." I picked up a burning branch from the fire, holding it like a torch. The flames cast wild shadows but provided more light than my flashlight, and fire had been humanity's defense against the darkness since the beginning of time. The splashing was getting closer. I could make out multiple sources now, at least 3, maybe 4 separate sets of movements converging on our position from different directions. "They're surrounding us," Tommy said, his voice cracking with fear. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we were just spooking ourselves. But I could hear it too. The methodical approach, the coordination, the way they were cutting off every possible escape route except the narrow land bridge, which was probably exactly where they wanted us to go. "Stay close to the fire," I said. "Whatever happens, don't let them separate us." The first one emerged from the water about 20 yards from our camp. In the flickering torchlight, it looked human at first glance. Upright posture, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head where a head should be. But something was wrong with the proportions. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, the head cocked at an angle that should have been impossible for a human neck. It stood there for a long moment, water dripping from its pale skin, studying us with eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. Then it smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous for any human mouth. "Oh, God," Tommy whispered. "What is that thing?" Before I could answer, 2 more emerged from different points around the island's perimeter. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was nothing like human locomotion. Their skin had a waxy, translucent quality that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and I could see dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. Boudreaux was barking frantically now, lunging toward the nearest creature before falling back to protect us. His canine instincts recognized what my rational mind was struggling to accept. These things weren't human, despite their overall shape. "What do you want?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The first creature tilted its head further to the side, studying me with those glowing eyes. When it spoke, its voice was like wet leaves rustling in the wind. "Hungry," it said. "So hungry." The other 2 began moving closer, their movements coordinated like pack hunters. Now I could see more details that my mind had initially refused to process. Their fingers ended in claws rather than nails. Their skin was covered in a pattern of scales so fine they looked like texture rather than individual plates. And their mouths. When they opened their mouths, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth designed for tearing flesh. "The fire," I said to Tommy without taking my eyes off the creatures. "Build up the fire. They don't like the light." It was a guess based on nothing but desperation, but as Tommy threw more wood on the flames, the creatures did seem to hesitate. They didn't retreat, but their advance slowed. "That's not going to work forever," the first one said, its horrible voice carrying clearly across the water. "Fire burns down. Fire goes out. We wait." "What are you?" I asked, playing for time while my mind raced through our options. "Old," it replied. "Older than your grandfather's grandfather. We remember when the first humans came to our waters. We remember how they tasted." The Boudoir family. Papa's stories hadn't been folklore after all. Or, if they had been, they'd been based on something real. Something that had been here long before European settlers arrived. Something that had learned to hunt alongside the human predators who'd made these waters their hunting ground. "The people we heard screaming," Tommy said. "Where are they?" The creature's smile widened impossibly. "Fed us, for a while, but we are still hungry, always hungry." A fourth creature emerged from the water behind us, cutting off our retreat to the land bridge. This one was larger than the others, its movements more confident. When it spoke, the others fell silent. "Enough talk," it said. "Take them." They moved as one, flowing toward us with inhuman speed and coordination. I swung my burning branch at the nearest one, catching it across the face with a shower of sparks. It shrieked and fell back, clawing at burned flesh, but the others kept coming. Boudreaux launched himself at the largest creature, 70 pounds of furious dog slamming into its chest. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and fur, the creature's claws raking across my dog's flanks while Boudreaux's teeth found purchase in its throat. Tommy surprised me by actually using the hatchet, burying it in the shoulder of the creature coming from his side. It screamed and spun away, black blood spraying from the wound, but the injury only seemed to enrage it further. "The P-Rogue!" I shouted, grabbing Tommy's arm. "We have to reach the boat!" But even as I said it, I could see it was too late. More creatures were emerging from the water. 6, 8, maybe 10 of them. They'd been waiting just beneath the surface, letting us see only a few so we wouldn't realize how badly we were outnumbered. The largest creature threw Boudreaux aside like a rag doll. My dog hit a tree with a sickening thud and didn't get up, though I could see his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Run!" I shoved Tommy toward the narrowest gap in their encirclement. "Head for the trees." We broke through their line by pure luck and adrenaline, crashing into the underbrush beyond our campsite. Branches tore at our clothes and faces as we stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the fading glow of our abandoned fire. Behind us, the creatures gave chase with howls that were nothing like human voices. They moved through the dense vegetation like it wasn't there, crashing through palmetto and cypress knees that slowed us to a desperate crawl. "This way," Tommy gasped, pulling me toward what looked like slightly higher ground. We stumbled up a low ridge, our feet sinking into boggy soil that grabbed at our boots with every step. I could hear the creatures getting closer, their calls echoing from multiple directions as they spread out to flank us. "There." Tommy pointed through the trees to a structure I hadn't noticed in daylight, an old trapper's cabin, half collapsed but still standing. "Maybe we can hold them off." It was our only chance. We crashed through the door, which hung askew on rusted hinges, and found ourselves in a single room that smelled of rot and abandonment. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, revealing a dirt floor littered with the remains of whoever had last used this place as shelter. "Help me with this," I said, grabbing one end of a heavy wooden table. Together, we managed to barricade the door just as the first creature slammed into it from outside. The entire structure shook with the impact. These things were stronger than they looked, and the cabin's walls were already half rotten. We had minutes at most before they broke through. "The roof," Tommy said, looking up at the holes where cypress shingles had fallen away. "They could come through the roof." He was right. As if summoned by his words, I heard claws scraping against wood overhead. They were already climbing up the walls, using their inhuman strength and agility to reach the weak points in our makeshift fortress. "Find something to fight with," I said, searching the debris on the floor. My hand closed around the handle of an old machete, its blade rusty but still sharp enough to cut. And stay away from those holes. A pale hand thrust through a gap in the roof, claws extended to rake at anything within reach. I swung the machete with all my strength, severing 3 fingers in a spray of black blood. The creature shrieked and withdrew, but I could hear others taking its place. "Marcus!" Tommy's voice was tight with terror. "The door!" The barricade was giving way. I could see claws working at the gaps between boards, prying them apart with methodical precision. More importantly, I could see eyes, dozens of glowing eyes pressed against every opening. "How many are there?" Tommy whispered. "Too many," I admitted. "Way too many." But even as I said it, something was nagging at me. Something about the way they'd herded us here, the careful coordination of their attack. Almost like they were following a script they'd performed many times before. "Tommy," I said slowly, "what if this isn't random? What if they brought us here on purpose?" "What do you mean?" I was thinking about the camping spot that had seemed so perfect, the way Boudreaux had acted from the very beginning, the carved symbols on the cypress tree that I'd dismissed so easily. What if they've been hunting people here for generations? What if this whole area is their territory, and they've learned to use it like a trap? The door finally gave way, boards splintering as the creatures poured through the opening. But instead of attacking immediately, they formed a circle around us, their glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight that streamed through the broken roof. The largest one, the one that had thrown Boudreaux aside, stepped forward. In the better light, I could see more details of its horrific anatomy. Its skin wasn't just pale but actually transparent in places, revealing the dark organs beneath. Its mouth stretched almost from ear to ear, filled with rows of shark-like teeth. "You understand now," it said in that rustling leaves voice. "Good. Understanding makes the fear taste better." "You've done this before," I said. It wasn't a question. "Many times. Your kind is so predictable. Show them a perfect camping spot, let them settle in, feel safe, then harvest them when they're ripe with terror." "The people who were screaming—" "Bait," the creature said simply. "Recordings we've learned to make. Your own voices, crying out in perfect anguish, played back to draw others into our territory." The psychological horror of it hit me like a physical blow. Those screams we'd heard, the ones that had sounded so human, so terrified. They had been human, but not from people who were being attacked tonight. They were the death cries of previous victims, somehow captured and replayed to lure new prey into the same trap. "The markings on the tree," Tommy said, his voice barely a whisper. "They weren't territorial markers. They were—" "What? Tallies?" The creature's smile widened impossibly. "One mark for each group, each family, each lone wanderer who thought they could find peace in our waters." I counted back through my memory, trying to visualize those carved symbols. Dozens of marks, maybe more. Generations of victims who'd been lured to this same spot, terrorized in this same way, and ultimately consumed by these things that wore human shapes like badly fitting costumes. "But you made a mistake this time," I said, raising the machete. "You let us arm ourselves. You gave us time to think." The creature laughed, a sound like wind through a cemetery. "Armed with rust and rotted wood? Against claws that can tear through cypress bark? Against teeth that can crush bone?" It had a point. Even if Tommy and I fought with everything we had, we were outnumbered at least 10 to 1 by creatures that were faster, stronger, and better adapted to this environment than we could ever be. But as I looked around the circle of glowing eyes, I noticed something that gave me a flicker of hope. They were all focused on us, all pressed close to watch our final moments of terror. None of them were watching the holes in the roof anymore. I caught Tommy's eye and nodded slightly upward. He followed my gaze, and I saw understanding dawn on his face. It was a desperate plan with almost no chance of success, but it was better than standing here waiting to be torn apart. "You know what I think," I said to the largest creature, trying to keep its attention focused on me. "I think you're not as tough as you pretend to be. I think you're just parasites who've gotten fat and lazy feeding on helpless victims." The creature's eyes flared with anger. "You will learn respect when we peel the skin from your bones." "Yeah? You? And what army?" I raised the machete in what I hoped looked like a threatening gesture. "Come on then, let's see what you've got." The creature took a step forward, its claws extending to their full length. The others pressed closer, eager to witness the kill. That's when Tommy and I moved. Instead of retreating or trying to fight our way through the circle, we both jumped straight up, grabbing for the broken roof beams overhead. The creatures were so focused on our horizontal movements that our vertical escape caught them completely off guard. I hauled myself through a gap between rotted shingles, scraping my back raw on splintered wood, but not caring about anything except getting out of that circle of death. Tommy was right behind me, his new hiking boots giving him better purchase on the slippery wood than my old work boots. We rolled across the sagging roof and dropped to the ground on the far side of the cabin, landing hard but not breaking anything. Behind us, the creatures were howling with rage and frustration, crashing through the cabin's walls in their haste to follow. "The water," I gasped, pointing toward the dark channel that separated us from the higher ground beyond. "They came from the water. Maybe they can't travel far from it." It was another desperate guess, but we were beyond rational planning now. We crashed through the underbrush toward the bayou's edge, hoping to find some way across before the creatures caught up with us. What we found was my pirogue. It was beached on a small mud bar about 20 yards from shore, exactly where I'd left it that morning when we'd been setting up camp. Somehow, in all the chaos and terror, I'd forgotten that we had a way out of here, if we could reach it. "Can you make it?" I asked Tommy, eyeing the distance between shore and boat. "I'm a better swimmer than you are," he replied, which was true. Tommy had been on the swim team in high school. We waded into the dark water, trying to move quietly despite our desperation. The bottom was soft mud that sucked at our feet, and the water was colder than I'd expected. By the time we reached the pirogue, we were both shivering and covered in swamp muck. Behind us, the creatures had found our trail. I could see their pale forms moving through the trees, spread out in a search line that covered every possible route back to solid ground. But they seemed to be staying on shore, confirming my guess that they were somehow limited by their need to remain near the water. "Where do we go?" Tommy whispered as we quietly pushed off from the mud bar. "Away from here," I said, taking up the paddle. "As far and as fast as we can." But even as I said it, I realized we had a problem. In the darkness, with no landmarks visible and my nerves shot to hell, I had no idea which direction would take us back to the truck. Every channel looked the same, every stand of cypress identical to every other. We were lost in the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin with creatures hunting us and no way to navigate except by guesswork. "There," Tommy said, pointing to what looked like a slightly wider channel. "That looks familiar." It didn't to me, but I was willing to try anything. I steered the pirogue into the channel, paddling as quietly as possible while straining my ears for sounds of pursuit. For a while, it seemed like we might actually escape. The channel led to another, which connected to a third, and gradually the sounds of the creatures faded behind us. My arms were aching from the unaccustomed paddling. Navigating at night required much more effort than in daylight, but I didn't dare slow down. Then Tommy made a sound I'd never heard from him before, a low moan of despair that made my blood run cold. "Marcus," he whispered, "look." I followed his gaze and felt my heart sink. Ahead of us, glowing faintly in the moonlight, was our abandoned campsite. The fire was still burning, though lower than when we'd left. Our tents were still standing, and surrounding the entire island, dozens of glowing eyes watched our approach from the water. We'd been paddling in circles for over an hour, and they'd been herding us the entire time. Every channel we'd chosen, every turn we'd made, had been subtly guided by creatures positioned just out of sight. They'd let us think we were escaping while leading us right back to where they wanted us. "Jesus Christ," Tommy whispered. "We never had a chance, did we?" I wanted to argue, to keep fighting, but the truth was becoming impossible to deny. These things had been hunting in these waters for generations, maybe centuries. They knew every channel, every current, every trick that panicking prey might try. We weren't the first people to attempt this exact escape, and we wouldn't be the last. "Maybe we can still," I began, but Tommy cut me off. "Look at your dog," he said quietly. I turned toward our campsite and saw Boudreaux standing at the water's edge. He was alive, which was more than I'd dared hope, but something was wrong with the way he was standing. Too rigid, too still, like a statue of a dog rather than a living animal. "Boudreaux," I called softly. "Here, boy." The dog turned toward my voice, and I saw his eyes. They glowed with the same cold light as the creatures surrounding us. "Oh God," I whispered. "They got him. They did something to him." But even as I said it, I realized it was worse than that. As we drifted closer to shore, I could see that Boudreaux wasn't injured at all. His fur was clean, his posture perfect, his tail wagging in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. He looked exactly like himself, except for the eyes and the way he never blinked. "That's not your dog anymore," Tommy said. "That's one of them, wearing your dog's shape." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If they could take Boudreaux's form so perfectly, what else could they mimic? How many of the people we'd heard screaming tonight had actually been these creatures, practicing their deception? "Tommy," I said slowly, a terrible thought beginning to form. "When did you first suggest this camping trip?" "What do you mean?" But his voice sounded different now, flatter somehow. "Think about it. Really think. Was it your idea or mine?" There was a long pause. Too long. When Tommy finally answered, his voice had lost all trace of the fear that had been there moments before. "Does it matter now, Marcus?" I turned to look at my oldest friend, the man I'd known since we were 12 years old, and saw a stranger wearing his face. The same features, the same haircut, even the same nervous habit of chewing his lower lip. But the eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing, and they never blinked. "You're not, Tommy," I whispered. "Of course I am." But even as he spoke, his form began to shift subtly. His limbs grew longer. His skin took on that waxy, translucent quality I'd seen in the others. "I've been Tommy since we left Baton Rouge, since we loaded the truck, since we planned this trip. Where is he? Where's the real Tommy?" The thing wearing my friend's face smiled with too many teeth. "Safe. Fed to the waters weeks ago. But his memories were delicious. So full of friendship and trust and happy times with good old Marcus." I felt sick. Every conversation we'd had on the drive here, every shared laugh about old times, every moment I'd felt grateful to be reconnecting with my childhood friend. It had all been a lie. This creature had been studying me, learning my weaknesses, preparing me for slaughter. "The phone calls," I said, pieces clicking into place. "You called me last month about getting together. That wasn't Tommy at all." "He had such fond memories of you," the creature said, its voice losing the last traces of Tommy's familiar cadence. "Such guilt about losing touch over the years. It was easy to use those feelings to lure you here." I was alone in a pirogue in the middle of a hostile swamp, surrounded by creatures that could perfectly mimic human form, with no idea which of my memories were real and which had been carefully constructed lies. The psychological horror of it was almost worse than the physical danger. "Why the elaborate deception?" I asked, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to buy time while I figured out what to do next. "Why not just grab me from my apartment? Where's the fear in that?" The Tommy thing tilted its head in that unnatural way. "Fear makes the meat tender. Terror adds flavor. Your kind tastes so much better when you've had time to truly understand your helplessness. Around us, the other creatures were slowly closing in. I could see them moving through the water with barely a ripple, their pale forms gliding beneath the surface like alligators. But unlike gators, these things showed no hesitation around the pirogue. They were clearly planning to tip us over and finish this in the water where they had every advantage. "One more question," I said, gripping the paddle tighter. "My dog, the real Boudreaux, is he dead since this morning?" the creature said with casual cruelty. "We needed his form to help complete the illusion. Don't worry, we'll take good care of his shape. Use it to lure other dog lovers into our territory." Something inside me snapped at that. Boudreaux had been with me for 6 years, through 2 breakups, the loss of my job on the rigs, my father's death. He'd been the one constant in my life, the one thing I could always count on for unconditional loyalty and love. And these things had killed him just to make their trap more effective. I swung the paddle with all my strength, catching the Tommy thing across the side of its head. The blow sent it tumbling into the dark water with a splash that shattered the oppressive silence of the swamp. For a moment, the other creatures seemed stunned by my sudden violence. They'd been so focused on psychological torture that they hadn't expected physical resistance. That moment of hesitation was all I needed. I paddled with desperate fury toward the narrow channel that led away from our campsite. Behind me, the Tommy thing was thrashing in the water, shrieking curses in that rustling leaves voice while the others converged on its position. The pirogue shot into the channel faster than I'd ever moved it before. My shoulders burned with the effort, but adrenaline and rage gave me strength I didn't know I had. These things had taken everything from me: my friend, my dog, my sense of safety in a place I'd loved since childhood. But they hadn't taken my life yet, and I was going to make them work for it. The channel twisted and turned through stands of cypress, and I navigated by instinct more than sight. Some primitive part of my brain had taken over, reading the subtle signs of current and depth that my grandfather had taught me decades ago. Left here, right there, straight through the gap between those 2 massive tree trunks. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, the splash of multiple bodies moving through water at inhuman speed, the crash of something large forcing its way through underbrush, the periodic calls they made to coordinate their hunt. But I was moving faster than they'd expected, and the pirogue was designed for exactly this kind of navigation. It skimmed over submerged logs that would have stopped a larger boat, slipped through gaps barely wider than my shoulders, rode the subtle currents that could carry it silently through the darkest corners of the swamp. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could outrun them long enough to reach help. There were other camps scattered throughout the basin, fishing guides who knew these waters as well as I did, even game wardens who patrolled the area. That hope died when I heard the sound of an outboard motor starting up somewhere behind me. They had a boat. Of course they had a boat. They'd been hunting these waters for generations, and they would have adapted to use whatever tools gave them an advantage. While I was limited to the speed of human muscles and a wooden paddle, they had mechanized pursuit. The motor grew louder, echoing off the water and trees in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its exact location. But it was definitely getting closer, and there was no way a pirogue could outrun a motorboat in open water. I needed to get out of the main channels, find someplace too shallow or too choked with vegetation for their boat to follow. The problem was that such places would also trap me, turning potential refuge into a dead end where they could corner me at their leisure. A spotlight beam swept across the water behind me, brilliant white light that turned the night into harsh shadows and blinding glare. I ducked low in the pirogue, using the cypress knees and hanging moss for cover, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they spotted me. The beam passed overhead, close enough that I could feel its heat on my back. I held my breath, pressing myself against the bottom of the boat while Spanish moss trailed in the water inches from my face. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze, my own voice, calling out across the water. "Help me! Somebody help me! They killed Tommy!" It was perfect, exactly how I would sound if I were genuinely calling for rescue. But I was right here, crouched in the bottom of a pirogue, keeping as quiet as possible. They were using my voice the same way they'd used the earlier screams, trying to draw other people into danger, or maybe they were trying to flush me out, make me respond to what sounded like my own desperate plea for help. The spotlight beam swept back and forth methodically, and I realized they weren't just hunting randomly anymore. They were working a grid pattern, covering every inch of water in a systematic search. Professional hunters using modern tools and ancient instincts. I had maybe minutes before that beam found me, and when it did, this would all be over. That's when I remembered the old trapper's shack where Tommy and I had made our brief stand. Not that one, it was too close to their base of operations, but another one that Papa had shown me years ago. A place where Acadians had once processed nutria pelts, built on stilts over a deep channel about a mile from here. If it was still standing, if I could find it in the darkness, it might offer the kind of defensible position that could buy me time until dawn. The creatures seemed to be primarily nocturnal, and daylight might give me advantages they couldn't match. It was a long shot, but it was better than floating here waiting for that spotlight to find me. I eased the pirogue back into motion, staying low and paddling with just my hands to minimize noise. The old shack was in a section of the basin that most people avoided. The water was deeper there, the currents tricky, and there were rumors of quicksand bogs that could swallow a boat whole. Perfect reasons for the creatures to avoid it too, I hoped. The journey took forever. Every shadow potentially hiding an enemy. Every sound possibly signaling discovery. The spotlight beam continued its methodical sweep behind me, but the distance was growing. Either they were being more careful now, or they'd lost my trail completely. I almost missed the shack when I finally reached the right area. It was smaller than I remembered, and decades of weather had turned the cypress planks almost black. But it was still there, still standing on its stilts about 4 feet above the waterline. I tied the pirogue to one of the support posts and climbed carefully up the rotted ladder built into the side. The structure groaned under my weight, but held. The interior was a single room, maybe 10 feet square, with gaps between the floorboards that let me see the dark water below. Ancient equipment lay scattered around. Rusty traps, coils of rope that crumbled at a touch, glass floats that had somehow survived the decades intact. But, more importantly, the shack had something the cabin hadn't. A clear view in all directions, and only one way up. I positioned myself near the doorway where I could watch the approaches while staying hidden in the shadows. The machete was still in my hand, though I wasn't sure how much good it would do against creatures that could perfectly mimic human form. For a long time, nothing happened. The swamp settled into the kind of deep quiet that comes just before dawn, when even the night hunters have finished their work and the day shift hasn't yet awakened. I began to hope that maybe I'd actually lost them, that they'd given up the hunt in favor of easier prey. Then I heard my name being called from the water below. "Marcus! Marcus, where are you?" It was Tommy's voice, the real Tommy's voice, full of pain and confusion and desperate hope. Not the flat, emotionless tone the creature had used, but the warm, familiar sound of my oldest friend calling out in genuine distress. "Marcus, please. I got away from them, but I'm hurt bad. I can't see you, but I can hear you moving around up there. Please help me." I crept to the edge of the doorway and looked down. There was a figure in the water below, treading with obvious difficulty. In the dim, pre-dawn light, it looked exactly like Tommy. Same face, same hair, even the same t-shirt he'd been wearing when we made camp. "Oh, thank God," the figure said, looking up at me with relief written across every feature. "I thought they'd gotten you too. We have to get out of here, Marcus. There are more of them than we thought, and they're—" "Stop," I said quietly. The figure paused, water lapping around its chin. "What?" "Tommy's dead. The thing wearing his face told me so. You're not him." For a long moment, the figure in the water maintained its expression of hurt confusion. Then, slowly, it began to smile. "Very good, Marcus. You're learning." The voice was still Tommy's, but the tone was all wrong. Amused, predatory, pleased with itself. As I watched, the figure's features began to shift. Not dramatically, just subtle changes that made it clear this was a copy rather than the original. The eyes were a slightly different shade of brown. The scar on Tommy's forehead from a childhood accident was missing. Small details that only someone who'd known the real person for 20 years would notice. "But you hesitated," the creature continued. "For just a moment, you wanted to believe. That's all we need, Marcus. That moment of hope before the final despair." Around the shack, I could see other figures emerging from the water. All of them wore familiar faces. Tommy, my ex-girlfriend Sarah, my father, even my mother who'd been dead for 10 years. A congregation of my past gathered to witness my destruction. "Everyone you've ever loved," the Tommy thing said. "Everyone you've ever trusted. We know them all, Marcus. We've tasted their memories, learned their mannerisms, perfected their voices. How will you ever trust anyone again, knowing what we can do?" It was psychological warfare at its most refined. Even if I somehow survived this night, how could I ever look at another human face without wondering if it was real? How could I ever feel safe in my own memories, knowing how perfectly these things could counterfeit the people I cared about? "You can't keep this up forever," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Daylight's coming, and you'll have to retreat to whatever holes you crawl into during the day." "Will we?" The My Father thing climbed onto one of the support posts with inhuman agility. "What makes you think we're limited by sunlight? We've been adapting for centuries, Marcus. Learning. Evolving." But even as it spoke, I noticed that the creatures were staying in the shadows cast by the shack, avoiding the patches of gray light that marked the approaching dawn. They might not be completely helpless in daylight, but they clearly preferred darkness. I just had to survive until full sunrise, maybe 2 hours, probably less. "Besides," the My Mother thing said in a perfect imitation of her voice, "we don't need to wait for nightfall to finish this. We just need you to come down here with us." And why would I do that? In answer, they began to change. Not their faces. Those remained heartbreakingly familiar, but their voices. One by one, they began to call out in tones I remembered from childhood, from family gatherings, from the happiest moments of my life. My mother singing the lullaby she used to hum when I couldn't sleep. My father telling the same terrible jokes that had made me groan as a teenager but which I'd give anything to hear again. Tommy laughing at some shared memory from high school. It was horrible and beautiful and perfectly calculated to destroy my resolve. They knew exactly which emotional buttons to push, exactly how to make me want to believe that somehow, impossibly, the people I'd lost had come back to me. "We're all here. Marcus," my mother's voice whispered. "Everyone who ever loved you. Don't you want to join us? Don't you want to be together again?" For a moment, just a moment, I actually considered it. The loneliness of the past few years, the weight of loss and regret and missed opportunities, all of it could be washed away if I just climbed down from this rotting shack and let them embrace me. Then I remembered Boudreaux. Not the false Boudreaux they'd created to deceive me, but the real one. The way he'd whined at the truck, tried to warn me about the danger I was too blind to see. The way he'd fought to protect me even when he was hopelessly outmatched. The way he'd died because these things needed his form to make their trap more convincing. "Go to hell," I said. The creatures stopped their emotional manipulation and stared up at me with undisguised hatred. "So be it," the Tommy thing said. "We tried to make this easy for you." They came up the sides of the shack like spiders, moving with impossible speed and coordination. I swung the machete at the first one to reach the platform, but it flowed around the blade like liquid and drove its claws into my thigh. Pain shot through my leg as I stumbled backward, blood soaking through my jeans. The creature pressed its attack, driving me toward the center of the platform where the others could reach me from all sides. I swept the machete in a wide arc, forcing them back just long enough to grab one of the old glass floats from the floor. The sphere was heavy, probably used as a weight for fishing nets decades ago. "You want me?" I gasped, holding the float over one of the gaps in the floorboards. "Come and get me," I dropped the float through the gap, and it hit the water below with a splash that sent ripples across the surface. In the gray, pre-dawn light, those ripples caught and reflected what little illumination was available. The creatures recoiled as if I'd thrown acid at them. "Light," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. "You can't stand reflected light." It made sense in a horrible way. These things lived in the depths of the swamp, in the darkest corners where light never penetrated. They'd adapted to hunt in absolute darkness, but that adaptation came with a cost. They were vulnerable to any kind of illumination, even the pale reflection of dawn off disturbed water. I grabbed another float and smashed it against the wall, creating a shower of glass fragments that sparkled like stars as they fell. The creatures scrambled away from the glittering cascade, some of them actually hissing like scalded cats. But there were limits to this defense. I only had a few more floats, and the fragments would sink quickly in the dark water below. I needed a more permanent source of reflected light. The answer came to me as I looked at the machete in my hand. The blade was old and rusty, but it still had enough of a reflective surface to catch and throw back the growing dawn light. I angled the blade toward the water, creating a beam of reflected illumination that swept across the platform like a searchlight. The creatures fell back before it, their perfect human disguises wavering like heat mirages. "That's right," I said, advancing slowly with the improvised light weapon. "Back off." But even as I spoke, I could see them adapting. Instead of retreating completely, they were positioning themselves to attack from angles where the reflected light couldn't reach. And as the sun continued to rise, the angle of illumination was changing, creating new shadows for them to exploit. I had maybe minutes before they figured out how to overwhelm my defense. That's when I heard the sound of an airboat approaching from the east. It was still distant, but growing closer fast. The distinctive roar of an airplane propeller pushing a flat-bottomed boat across the water at high speed. Game warden, probably, or maybe a fishing guide starting an early morning trip. The creatures heard it too. Their perfect human faces turned toward the sound with expressions of naked fury. "No," the Tommy thing snarled. "Not when we're so close." But they were already beginning to fade back into the water, their forms becoming less solid as the approaching dawn gave them fewer shadows to hide in. Whatever they were, they couldn't risk being seen by other humans in daylight. "This isn't over," my father's stolen voice called from the water. "We know where you live, Marcus. We know everyone you care about. We'll be waiting." Then they were gone, vanishing beneath the dark surface as if they'd never been there at all. The airboat rounded a bend in the channel, and I saw the distinctive uniform of a Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries warden. I'd never been so happy to see a government employee in my life. "Hey there," the warden called, cutting his engine as he approached the shack. "You okay, son? Heard some commotion out here on the radio." I almost laughed at the normalcy of it. After everything that had happened, after facing creatures that could steal human faces and memories, I was being rescued by a routine patrol. "I need to get out of here," I called back. My friend is dead, and my dog, they're both dead." The warden's expression grew serious as he maneuvered his boat closer to the shack. "What happened? Gator attack?" I opened my mouth to tell him the truth, then stopped. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding completely insane? Who would believe a story about shape-shifting creatures that hunted humans in the deep swamp? "I'm not sure," I said instead. "Something attacked our campsite. I managed to get away, but Tommy, I couldn't help him." It was close enough to the truth without crossing the line into unbelievable horror. The warden nodded grimly. He'd probably dealt with similar tragedies before, though hopefully not involving supernatural predators. "Come on down," he said. "We'll get you back to civilization and sort this all out." I climbed carefully down from the shack, my wounded leg protesting every movement. As the warden helped me into his boat, I took one last look back at the dark water where the creatures had vanished. They were still out there, still hunting, still perfecting their horrible craft of mimicry and murder, and they knew where I lived. The ride back to the boat launch took 45 minutes, during which I gave the warden a carefully edited version of events. Camping trip gone wrong, possible animal attack, my friend missing and presumed dead. He radioed for backup and a search team, though I knew they'd never find Tommy's body, or what was left of it. At the hospital in Morgan City, they cleaned and stitched my wounds while I answered questions from local police. I stuck to my story about animal attacks and mysterious accidents, leaving out every supernatural detail. They believed me, mostly because the alternative would have been too disturbing to consider. The search teams found our campsite 3 days later. Both tents were still standing, though they'd been torn open from the inside. They found blood, a lot of blood, but no bodies. The official report blamed gators and the challenging terrain of the deep swamp for preventing recovery of remains. I let them believe that. It was easier than the truth. But I couldn't forget what the creature had said in my father's voice. "We know where you live, Marcus. We'll be waiting." 6 months later, I sold my house in Plaquemine and moved to Colorado. Mountains instead of swamps, thin air instead of humid bayous, ski slopes instead of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. As far from Louisiana water as I could get while staying in the same country. I tell people I needed a change of scenery after losing my best friend. They assume it's about grief and trauma, and they're not wrong. They just don't understand the true nature of either. Sometimes, late at night in my Denver apartment, I hear familiar voices calling my name from the darkness outside. My mother's lullaby, Tommy's laugh, Boudreaux's bark. I know they're not real, can't be real this far from the Atchafalaya Basin, but I check the locks anyway. Because I learned something important that night in the swamp. The most perfect predators are the ones that make you want to be caught. And I can never be completely sure which of my memories are real anymore, and which ones they planted to keep me afraid. The worst part? Sometimes I find myself missing Louisiana, missing the place that tried to kill me, missing the life I had before I learned what was really lurking in those dark waters. That's how I know they're still hunting me, even from 1,000 miles away. They've made me doubt everything, trust nothing, fear everyone. In the end, maybe that was the real trap all along. My name is Marcus LeBlanc, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023. The invitation came through a work email that I almost deleted. Annual team building adventure, Atchafalaya Basin Wilderness Camping Trip. 3 days in Louisiana's largest wetland, supposedly to strengthen bonds between our software development team. I'd been working remotely for Bayou Tech Solutions for 2 years, and this would be my first time meeting most of my colleagues face-to-face. Sarah Chen, our project manager, had organized everything. She was one of those relentlessly optimistic people who believed every problem could be solved with proper planning and team synergy. At 28, she approached life with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a situation she couldn't handle through spreadsheets and positive thinking. "It'll be amazing, Marcus," she'd said during our video call. "I've researched the most pristine camping spots. We're going to Henderson Swamp, near the Whiskey Bay Pilot Channel. Completely off the grid, pure nature, just what we all need to disconnect and reconnect." Jake Morrison, our senior developer, had laughed during the same call. "Sarah, some of us actually prefer our nature with Wi-Fi and room service." At 31, Jake was perpetually sarcastic, using humor to deflect any situation that required genuine emotion. He'd agreed to come, but only after extracting promises that we'd return to civilization for dinner on the final night. Tommy Boudreaux was the only local among us. Born and raised in Lafayette, he knew the Atchafalaya Basin like most people knew their neighborhood streets. At 29, he was quiet and thoughtful, often speaking in the slow, measured cadence of someone who chose his words carefully. "Y'all sure about camping in October?" he'd asked. "That's when the water starts dropping and things change out there." The fourth member of our group was David Kim, our newest hire at 26. Fresh out of college, eager to prove himself, He'd volunteered for every extra project and jumped at the chance to join what he called an authentic American wilderness experience. His enthusiasm was exhausting but genuine. We met at the boat launch near Henderson at dawn on Friday morning. The October air was thick with humidity despite the early hour, and the cypress trees stretched into the morning mist like cathedral spires draped in Spanish moss. Tommy had arranged for his cousin's flat-bottom boat to take us deeper into the swamp than most tourists ever ventured. Whiskey Bay Pilot Channel, Tommy explained as we loaded our gear. Used to be a major shipping route back in the day. Now it's mostly just us fishermen and the occasional researcher. Perfect spot for camping if you don't mind the isolation. The boat ride took us through increasingly narrow waterways. Ancient cypress trees, some over 1,000 years old, rose from the dark water like monuments to a forgotten civilization. Sarah documented everything with her camera, chattering about the pristine ecosystem and how this experience would transform our team dynamic. "Look at this place," she said, gesturing at the endless canopy. "No cell towers, no internet, no distractions. Just us and nature." I checked my phone instinctively. No signal, as expected. The GPS showed our location as a blue dot surrounded by green emptiness. "How far are we from the nearest road?" David asked, his voice carrying a note of concern as the boat navigated between moss-draped branches. "About 12 miles, Tommy replied. "But out here, distance ain't measured in miles. It's measured in how well you know the water." Our campsite was on a small island of solid ground surrounded by channels and backwaters. Tommy's cousin, a weathered man named Boudreau, who spoke only in Cajun French to Tommy, helped us unload our supplies before disappearing back into the maze of waterways with a promise to return Sunday afternoon. The silence that followed his departure was profound. No traffic, no air conditioners, no electronic hum. Just the gentle lap of water against cypress knees and the distant call of birds I couldn't identify. "This is perfect," Sarah declared, consulting her laminated camping checklist. "Let's set up camp and then explore the area. I've planned activities to help us bond as a team." We pitched our tents in a rough circle around a central fire pit. The ground was spongy beneath our feet, decades of decomposed plant matter creating a carpet that felt alive. Jake wrinkled his nose at the smell, a mixture of stagnant water, rotting vegetation, and something else. Something faintly sweet and unpleasant. "Smells like something died," he muttered. "Everything dies out here," Tommy said quietly. "That's how the swamp stays alive." By afternoon, we'd settled into the rhythm of camp life. Sarah led us through team-building exercises that felt absurd in the primal setting. David attempted to document everything on his phone, forgetting it was useless without signal. Jake complained about mosquitoes while secretly helping Tommy prepare a fire for the evening. As darkness approached, the swamp transformed. The sounds changed. Daybirds replaced by night hunters, the splash of larger creatures moving through the water. Our fire became a precious beacon in an ocean of darkness that seemed to press against us from all sides. "Tell us a ghost story, Tommy," Sarah suggested as we sat around the flames. "You must know some local legends." Tommy poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night. "Out here, legends and truth get mixed up. The Atchafalaya's older than recorded history. Indians lived here for thousands of years before the first European ever saw these waters." "Come on," Jake pressed. "Every swamp has its monster stories. What's lurking out there in the dark?" "The rougarou," Tommy said finally. "Werewolf-like creature that hunts the bayous. But that's just stories parents tell children to keep them from wandering off alone." "Just stories?" David asked. Tommy's expression was unreadable in the firelight. "Maybe. Maybe not. Thing about the swamp is, it keeps its secrets. People go missing out here regular. Bodies ain't never found. Could be they drowned. Could be they got lost. Could be gators got them. Or could be something else." A sound echoed across the water. Long, mournful, almost human but not quite. We all froze. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. "Probably just an owl," Tommy said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound came again, closer this time. Definitely not an owl. It rose and fell like a lament, carried on the still air until it seemed to surround us. "That's not natural," Jake said, his usual sarcasm replaced by genuine unease. We sat in tense silence until the sound faded. The fire crackled and normal night sounds gradually resumed, but something had changed. The darkness felt heavier, more watchful. "I'm going to check the perimeter," I announced, grabbing a flashlight. "Don't go alone," Sarah said quickly. David volunteered to come with me. We walked to the edge of our small island, flashlight beams dancing across the water. Everything appeared normal. Cypress trees, Spanish moss, the gentle movement of current. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. "Marcus," David whispered, "look at the water." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Eyes, dozens of them reflecting our flashlight beams from just beneath the surface. Alligators, I realized with relief. Just alligators. But as we watched, the eyes began to move in patterns that didn't seem random. They formed rough circles around our island, some disappearing beneath the surface while others emerged further out. It was almost like they were taking turns, maintaining a constant watch. "Gators don't usually behave like that," David said. "No," I agreed. "They don't." We returned to the fire and shared our observation. Tommy frowned as he listened. "Gators are territorial," he said. "They don't cooperate like that. Something's got them spooked." The night passed uneasily. I volunteered for first watch, sitting by the dying fire while the others tried to sleep. The sounds of the swamp seemed different now, more purposeful, as if the darkness itself was alive and planning. Around 2 a.m. I heard footsteps. Not the splash of something moving through water, but actual footsteps on solid ground. Slow, deliberate, circling our camp just beyond the firelight's reach. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam in a wide arc, but saw nothing except trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I dozed fitfully until dawn. Saturday morning brought no relief. The oppressive atmosphere of the previous night lingered like smoke. Sarah tried to maintain her positive attitude, but even she seemed subdued as we prepared breakfast. "Maybe we should explore the area," she suggested. "Get some exercise, see the sights." Tommy shook his head. "Better to stay close to camp. Easy to get lost out here, especially for people who don't know the waterways." "We're not helpless tourists," Jake said irritably. "We can handle a little nature walk." Against Tommy's advice, we decided to explore. Sarah had researched historical sites in the area and was determined to find the ruins of an old settlement she'd read about online. "It's supposed to be about a mile north of here," she said, consulting a printout of a map she'd downloaded. "Those online maps ain't accurate," Tommy warned. "Half the landmarks they show been underwater for decades." But Sarah was insistent, and David was eager to document authentic historical sites. Even Jake seemed curious about exploring beyond our small island. We left camp in a group, following what appeared to be an old trail that wound through the wetlands. The trail was partially submerged, forcing us to step carefully on exposed roots and patches of solid ground. Ancient cypress trees created a canopy so thick that little sunlight penetrated to ground level. The air was still and heavy, filled with the sounds of unseen creatures moving through the water and undergrowth. After 30 minutes of difficult hiking, we reached a slightly elevated area where the remnants of old buildings were still visible. Weathered wooden posts marking what had once been a settlement, foundations partially reclaimed by the swamp, and a cemetery with headstones so old the inscriptions were illegible. "This is amazing," Sarah said, photographing everything. "Imagine the stories these ruins could tell." David wandered among the headstones, trying to decipher dates and names. Jake explored the foundation remnants, poking at rotting timbers with a stick. Tommy stood apart from the group, scanning the surrounding area with obvious unease. "We shouldn't stay here long," he said. "Why not?" Sarah asked. "This is exactly what we came to see." Places like this, they remember, especially places where people died hard. I was examining what appeared to be the remains of a church when I noticed something odd. The trees surrounding the settlement all leaned away from the center as if repelled by something. Spanish moss, which grew everywhere else in the swamp, was notably absent from this area. "Tommy," I called, "is it normal for vegetation to avoid certain spots like this?" He joined me, studying the unusual growth patterns. His expression grew troubled. "No," he said quietly. "That ain't normal at all." A scream cut through the air. We spun toward the sound and saw David standing frozen among the headstones, staring down at something near his feet. We rushed over and immediately understood his shock. One of the graves had been recently disturbed. The earth was freshly turned, and protruding from the loose soil was a human hand, pale and seemingly fresh. "That's impossible," Jake said. "These graves are over a century old." "Maybe an animal dug it up," Sarah suggested, but her voice shook. Tommy knelt beside the grave, examining the disturbed earth. "This wasn't done by no animal. See these marks? That's from tools. Someone's been digging here recent." The hand moved. We all saw it, a slight twitch of the fingers as if the buried person was trying to claw their way to the surface. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered. "We need to dig them out," David said, already looking around for something to use as a shovel. "No," Tommy said firmly. "We need to leave. Now." "We can't just leave someone buried alive," Sarah protested, but even as she spoke, more earth began to shift around other graves. What we'd taken for settling soil was actually movement from below. Something was stirring beneath multiple burial sites. "Run," Tommy said. We ran. The trail that had been difficult to navigate on the way in seemed to actively oppose our return. Roots caught our feet, branches grabbed at our clothes, and the path itself seemed to shift, forcing us deeper into the swamp instead of back toward camp. After 20 minutes of panicked movement, we stopped to catch our breath and get our bearings. "Where are we?" Sarah gasped. I checked my GPS, but the device showed only error messages. The compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "Equipment's gone haywire," I reported. "The sun," Jake said, pointing upward. "We can navigate by the sun." But the canopy was too thick to see the sky clearly, and what little sun we could glimpse seemed to be in the wrong position entirely. "This is impossible," David said. "We've only been walking for an hour. We can't be that lost." Tommy was studying the surrounding trees, looking for landmarks he recognized. "Something's wrong. These ain't the same trees we passed on the way out." "Trees are trees," Jake said dismissively. "No, they ain't. Each cypress is different if you know how to look, and I don't recognize none of these." We tried to retrace our steps, but every direction looked the same. Identical cypress trees, identical patches of water, identical draping of Spanish moss. It was as if we'd entered a maze where every path led to the same place. Hours passed. Our water ran low and the oppressive heat sapped our energy. Sarah's optimism finally cracked. "This isn't happening," she said, sitting heavily on a rotting log. "People don't just get lost like this, not in the modern world." "The modern world ends at the edge of the swamp," Tommy said quietly. That's when we heard the voices. Distant at first, carried on the still air like echoes from across water. Human voices calling our names, but something about the tone was wrong. Too eager, too knowing. "Marcus!" The voice that called my name sounded like Sarah, but Sarah was sitting right beside me. "Sarah!" Another voice identical to Jake's, but Jake stood frozen with his mouth shut. "Help us!" David's voice called from the swamp, though David was pale and shaking next to me. "Don't answer," Tommy warned. "Don't respond to them voices." But David, panicked and exhausted, cupped his hands and shouted, "We're here! We're lost!" The voices stopped immediately. The swamp fell silent. Then the laughter began. Not human laughter, something else, something that understood the concept of humor but had never truly felt joy. It echoed from all directions, seeming to come from the trees themselves. "We need to keep moving," I said. But when we tried to walk, we discovered that our feet sank deeper into the spongy ground with each step. What had been firm earth was now sucking at our boots like quicksand. "Stay calm," Tommy instructed. "Distribute your weight, move slow and steady." We made our way carefully across the increasingly unstable ground, but with each step, the swamp seemed to grow more hostile. Branches that hadn't been there moments before blocked our path. Water levels rose without explanation. The temperature dropped despite the October heat. That's when Jake disappeared. One moment he was behind me, complaining about mosquitoes. The next moment, silence. I turned to check on him and he was simply gone. "Jake," Sarah called. "Don't," Tommy warned, but too late. "Sarah," Jake's voice answered from our left. "I'm over here. I found the way back to camp." We moved toward the voice, but something in Tommy's expression stopped me. "That ain't Jake," he whispered. "What do you mean?" "Listen close. That voice, it's too perfect, like someone playing back a recording." He was right. Jake's responses sounded exactly like Jake, but they lacked the natural variations of human speech. Each word was perfectly enunciated, without the slight slurring that came from exhaustion and stress. "Jake," Sarah called again. "Where exactly are you?" "Right here, Sarah. Can't you see me?" But there was no one there. "We're being hunted," Tommy said quietly. "Something's using our voices to separate us." David was hyperventilating. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "It's real enough," I said, trying to keep my own panic in check. "We need to stick together and find our way back to camp." But without Jake, and with our equipment malfunctioning, we were truly lost. The swamp had become a labyrinth, and something in the maze was hunting us. As afternoon faded toward evening, we heard Jake calling again. But this time, the voice came from directly above us. I looked up and immediately wished I hadn't. 20 feet above our heads, something that looked like Jake hung upside down from a cypress branch. It wore Jake's clothes, had Jake's face, even had Jake's messy hair. But its neck was bent at an impossible angle and its eyes were solid black. "Found you," it said in Jake's voice and smiled with too many teeth. Sarah screamed. David fainted. I grabbed Tommy's arm and pulled him away from the tree, but he was already moving. "Mimics," he said as we ran. "Old Cajun stories talk about things that can copy people. Never believed them until now." We half-carried, half-dragged David as we fled deeper into the swamp. Behind us, Jake's voice called out in a sing-song tone. "Marco! Polo! Marco! Polo!" But it wasn't Jake anymore. Maybe it never had been. Night fell like a curtain, and we found ourselves on another small island, this one barely large enough for the four of us. We huddled together without a fire, afraid that light would attract whatever was hunting us. "What happened to Jake?" Sarah whispered. "The real Jake?" "Don't know," Tommy admitted. "But whatever took him can use his voice, his appearance. Probably got his memories too." David had recovered consciousness but remained largely catatonic, staring into the darkness with wide, unblinking eyes. "We have to assume anything that looks like Jake isn't Jake," I said. "How do we tell the difference?" "Ask him something only the real Jake would know. Something personal." But even as I said it, I realized the flaw in the plan. If the thing could access Jake's memories, it would know everything Jake knew. The night stretched endlessly. We took turns staying awake, watching for any sign of pursuit. Around midnight, I was on watch when I saw lights moving through the swamp, flashlight beams dancing between the trees in search patterns. "Tommy," I whispered, "someone's looking for us." He opened his eyes and studied the distant lights. "How many beams you count?" "3, maybe 4. Should be search and rescue by now. Jake's been missing for hours." But Tommy's expression remained grim. "What is it?" "Jake had the only other flashlight," he said. "Rest of ours died hours ago. So who's carrying them lights?" We watched in growing horror as the search beams methodically worked their way toward our location. The pattern was too organized, too purposeful. Real searchers would call out, make noise, try to attract attention. These lights moved in complete silence. "Jake?" one of the searchers called. It was my voice. "Marcus?" another called. It was Sarah's voice. "David?" a third voice, Tommy's voice. But we were all accounted for, all present on our tiny island. "Don't answer," Tommy breathed. The lights continued their search pattern, growing closer. In their glow, I could make out shapes moving between the trees. They looked human from a distance, but their movements were wrong. Too fluid, too coordinated, like dancers following choreography rather than people searching randomly through difficult terrain. One of the lights suddenly swung directly toward us, and in its beam I saw a face. My face. It wore my clothes, had my build and posture, but the eyes were wrong. Empty. Like looking at a photograph instead of a living person. It raised its hand and waved at me. I fought the urge to wave back. The searchers passed our island without stopping, their lights disappearing into the depths of the swamp. But I knew they'd be back. Whatever was out there was patient, systematic. It was learning about us, copying us, preparing something. "We can't stay here," I whispered. "Can't leave either," Tommy replied. "At least here we can see them coming." Dawn brought no relief. If anything, the swamp seemed more hostile in daylight. The water around our island had risen during the night, leaving us with barely enough dry ground to stand on. Worse, the water itself had changed color, from the natural brown of tannins to an oily black that seemed to absorb light. David finally spoke. His first words since the previous afternoon. "The water's moving wrong." He was right. Instead of the gentle current typical of swamp channels, the water around us moved in slow, deliberate circles. It reminded me uncomfortably of the way the alligator eyes had moved the first night. Purposeful, coordinated, unnatural. "Something's controlling it," Sarah said, her voice hollow with exhaustion and fear. That's when we saw Jake. The real Jake, or what was left of him. He stood waist-deep in the black water about 50 yards away, perfectly motionless. His skin was pale gray and his clothes hung on him like wet rags. But he was definitely alive. I could see his chest rising and falling. "Jake!" Sarah called before Tommy could stop her. Jake turned his head toward us with mechanical precision. His face was slack, expressionless, but his eyes held a desperate awareness as if his consciousness was trapped behind a mask he couldn't remove. He opened his mouth and spoke in someone else's voice, a woman's voice, old and harsh. "Come into the water, children. Come home to ma mère." "That ain't Jake talking," Tommy said. "Something's got hold of him." Jake began walking toward us, moving through the water with unnatural ease. The black liquid seemed to part for him, creating a path of dry ground that extended from his position to our island. "Jake, fight it," Sarah pleaded. "Whatever's controlling you, fight it." For a moment, Jake's expression flickered. His own voice broke through. "Run. Can't. Control. Run." Then the other voice returned, stronger. "Don't make ma mère angry, children. She's been so lonely in the deep water." The dry path reached our island. Jake stepped onto solid ground, water streaming from his clothes in patterns that defied gravity, flowing upward and forming shapes in the air, reaching fingers, grasping hands, faces twisted in silent screams. David broke first. He ran toward the opposite edge of our shrinking island, but the water there began to bubble and churn. Something large moved beneath the surface. "Nowhere to run, petite," Jake said in the woman's voice. "Ma mère has you now." Tommy grabbed a piece of driftwood, the closest thing to a weapon available. "What do you want?" Jake's head tilted to an impossible angle, nearly 90 degrees to the left. "Want? Ma mère wants company. Been alone so long in the deep places. So very long." "Let Jake go," I demanded. "Take me instead." Jake laughed with the woman's voice. "Oh, she'll take you all, Cher, one by one. But the boy, he fought so hard. Such spirit. She likes spirit." I realized with sick certainty that Jake was still conscious inside his own body, aware but helpless as something else used him like a puppet. The desperate look in his eyes confirmed it. "How do we stop this?" Sarah whispered. "Salt," Tommy said suddenly. "Spirits hate salt water. That's why they stay in the freshwater swamps." But we had no salt, and even if we did, we were surrounded by the creature's domain. Jake took another step toward us, and I saw that his feet weren't quite touching the ground. He hovered inches above the surface, suspended by invisible strings. "Choose," he said in the woman's voice. "Which one comes to ma mère first? Choose, or she takes you all at once." The water around our island began to rise again. Soon there would be nowhere left to stand. That's when David surprised us all. "I'll go," he said, stepping forward. "I'll come with you. Just let the others leave." "David, no," Sarah protested. But David was already walking toward Jake, his face set with grim determination. "Promise me they can leave. Promise me." Jake's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "Such a good boy. Ma mère will enjoy your company." David reached Jake and extended his hand. The moment their fingers touched, David's body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, and when they returned to normal, they held the same trapped awareness that haunted Jake's face. "Two puppets are better than one," David said in the woman's voice. But David had done something else. While pretending to surrender, he'd palmed something from his pocket, a small survival knife, barely more than a blade attached to a keychain. As the entity took control of his body, he managed one last act of defiance. He drove the tiny blade into Jake's thigh. Jake screamed, not with the woman's voice but with his own. The connection broke for just a moment, long enough for Jake to gasp out, "Iron! Cold iron breaks the connection." The woman's voice returned immediately, angry now. "Clever boy, but too late." Jake's hand shot out and grabbed David's throat, but the damage was done. Tommy was already moving, pulling a rusty can opener from his camping supplies. "Iron," he said, brandishing the tool. "Spirits can't abide cold iron." But before Tommy could reach them, both Jake and David stepped backward into the water and sank beneath the surface without a splash. The black water closed over them as if they'd never existed. "No!" Sarah screamed, starting toward the water's edge. I caught her arm. "They're gone. We can't help them now." But even as I said it, I saw shapes moving beneath the surface. Jake and David, walking along the bottom of the swamp, their hair floating upward like seaweed. They looked up at us through the dark water and mouthed words we couldn't hear. The water began to recede, leaving us stranded on our tiny island. But we weren't alone. The things that had been hunting us emerged from the tree line. Perfect copies of ourselves, but wrong in subtle ways. My duplicate smiled too widely. Sarah's copy moved with predatory grace that the real Sarah had never possessed. Even Tommy's doppelganger stood with perfect posture, unlike the real Tommy's habitual slouch. "Time to come home," my duplicate said in my voice. "Ma mère is waiting," said Sarah's copy. Tommy raised his rusty can opener like a sword. "Cold iron," he warned. "Come closer and find out how much it hurts." The duplicates hesitated. Whatever force controlled them had learned to fear iron from Jake's small act of rebellion. "Smart boy," my duplicate acknowledged. "But iron can't protect you forever, and ma mère is very patient." They didn't attack. Instead, they began to circle our island at a safe distance, maintaining their vigil like the alligators had on our first night, waiting for us to weaken, to make a mistake, to let our guard down. The day passed in tense standoff. We took turns holding Tommy's can opener, the only weapon that seemed to affect our supernatural stalkers. But exhaustion was taking its toll. Without food or water, we couldn't maintain our defense indefinitely. As evening approached, I realized we had one chance. "The boat," I said. Tommy's cousin is supposed to pick us up tomorrow, if we can survive until then. That's assuming he can find us, Sarah said. We're not even sure where we are anymore. But Tommy was nodding slowly. Boudreaux knows these waters better than anyone. If anyone can track us down, it's him. Will he have iron? I asked. Boudreaux's boat is steel-hulled, and he carries iron tools for engine repairs. If we can reach him... It was a slim hope, but better than no hope at all. That night we discovered something else about our captors. They couldn't cross running water. When the tide changed and a current began flowing past our island, the duplicates were forced to retreat to higher ground. For a few precious hours, we were relatively safe. Flowing water, Tommy explained. Another old protection. Moving water purifies itself, washes away evil influences. But the tide wouldn't run forever, and our island continued to shrink. By morning, we'd be completely submerged. Dawn brought the sound of an outboard motor. Boudreaux's boat appeared through the morning mist, moving slowly through the channels as he searched for our original campsite. But we were miles from where we should have been, and he was heading in the wrong direction. "Signal him," I urged. Sarah waved her bright yellow jacket above her head. I used my phone's camera flash, creating a strobe effect that might catch his attention. Tommy cupped his hands and shouted in Cajun French, but our duplicates were shouting too, using our voices to create confusion. From Boudreaux's perspective, calls for help were coming from multiple directions. The boat stopped, engine idling as he tried to determine the source of the distress calls. That's when Jake and David broke the surface. They rose from the black water like creatures from the deep, still wearing their camping clothes but moving with inhuman grace. Water streamed from their bodies in impossible patterns, and their eyes reflected light like mirrors. They began to swim toward Boudreaux's boat. "No!" I screamed, but my voice was lost among the chorus of false calls. Boudreaux saw them approaching and moved to help, just as any decent person would do when confronted with swimmers in distress. He extended a gaff pole toward Jake, offering to pull him aboard. Jake grabbed the pole and vomited a stream of black water into the boat. Boudreaux stumbled backward, but it was too late. The contaminated water spread across the boat's deck, and everywhere it touched began to smoke and corrode. Within seconds, the metal was dissolving like acid had been poured on it. Jake and David climbed aboard the sinking vessel. Boudreaux reached for his toolbox, probably looking for a weapon, but David moved with supernatural speed, covering the distance between them in a single bound. The last thing we saw was Boudreaux's face, his eyes going wide with terror as David's hand touched his forehead. Then all three figures sank beneath the surface as the boat dissolved completely. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered. "It's growing stronger." She was right. Whatever force controlled the swamp was gaining power with each person it claimed. Jake and David had been prisoners, but Boudreaux might be something worse. A willing convert, his soul corrupted rather than merely trapped. The water around our island began to churn. Something large was rising from the depths. Boudreaux's head broke the surface, but his face was no longer human. His features had elongated, his skin turned gray-green like algae, and his eyes had become completely black. When he opened his mouth, swamp water poured out along with words in that same harsh woman's voice. "Enough games, children. Time to come home to Mamère." The water rose higher, and our island disappeared completely. We found ourselves standing on the surface of the black water as if it were solid ground, but I could feel it shifting beneath our feet like thick mud. All around us, the swamp began to change. Trees withered and died in seconds, their bark peeling away to reveal white bone underneath. Spanish moss fell like rain, dissolving before it hit the water. The very air grew thick and hard to breathe. "The whole swamp," Tommy gasped. "She's killing the whole swamp." "Not killing, Cher," Boudreaux said in the woman's voice, "transforming, making it into something new, something hungry." More shapes emerged from the water. Not just Jake and David, but others. Dozens of others. Men and women in clothing from different eras, all with the same gray-green skin and black eyes, all moving in perfect synchronization. "How many?" Sarah asked in horror. "Ma mère has been collecting for a very long time," Boudreau replied. "Fishermen, hunters, researchers, tourists, all the lost souls who wandered too deep into her domain." The army of the drowned began to close in around us. We pressed back to back, Tommy holding his can opener like a talisman. "Iron won't save you now," Boudreau continued. "Too many of us, too much power. But Ma mère is merciful. Join willingly, and she'll let you keep some of your memories. Fight, and she'll take everything." "Who is she?" I demanded. "What is Ma mère?" Boudreau's ruined face attempted a smile. "Old magic, boy. Older than the Europeans, older than the Indians. She was here when this land was still under the ocean, waiting in the deep places. When the water receded, she stayed. When people came, she learned to use them." "A sea witch," Tommy breathed. "Marie Laveau always said there were things in the deep water that shouldn't be disturbed." "Clever boy. But knowledge won't save you now." The circle of drowned souls tightened. I could smell them now, the stench of stagnant water and decay, but underneath it, something else. Something that reminded me of hospitals and morgues. That's when I realized what we were really facing. "You're not possessed," I said to Jake as he approached. "You're dead, all of you. She's puppeting corpses." Jake's body stopped moving. For a moment, his face showed confusion, as if he'd forgotten what he was supposed to be doing. Then David spoke in the woman's voice. "Death is just another state of being, Cher. Ma mère gives purpose to the discarded flesh." "But some part of you is still in there," I continued, speaking directly to Jake. "I can see it in your eyes. You're fighting her." "Stop talking to them," Tommy warned. "It's not Jake anymore." But I pressed on. "Jake, remember why you came here. You didn't want to come camping. You wanted room service and Wi-Fi. You made jokes about everything because you were scared of letting people see who you really were." Jake's face twitched. For just a moment, his voice broke through. "Marcus, can't. She's so cold." Then David's hand shot out and grabbed Jake's shoulder. The connection snapped back into place and Jake's eyes went dead again. "Touching," Boudreau said, "but futile. The boy belongs to Ma mère now, as do you all." The circle continued to close. 20 feet, 15, 10. Tommy raised his can opener, but we all knew it wouldn't be enough. Too many of them, and only one small piece of iron. That's when Sarah did something unexpected. She began to sing. It was a hymn, something from her childhood. Her voice clear and strong despite our desperate situation. The words echoed across the unnatural stillness of the dying swamp. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The drowned souls stopped advancing. Several of them clutched their heads as if in pain. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Boudreau snarled in the woman's voice, "Stop that noise." But Sarah continued singing, and something extraordinary began to happen. The black water around us started to clear, becoming the natural brown of tannins again. A few of the withered trees showed signs of life, Spanish moss beginning to regrow on their branches. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. One of the drowned souls, a woman in a dress from the 1940s, suddenly looked up with clear, human eyes. "I remember," she gasped. "I remember my name. Mary Catherine Boudreau. I was picking flowers for Sunday service when—" "Silence!" the woman's voice shrieked through multiple throats, but it was too late. Sarah's song had broken something, weakened the hold the entity had on its victims. More of the drowned souls began to remember who they'd been, and with memory came resistance. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. The water continued to clear. Real sunlight broke through the canopy for the first time in days. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on us began to lift. But ma mère wasn't finished. The water beneath us suddenly gave way, and we plunged into the depths of the swamp. Down, down, through layers of black water that seemed to go on forever. My lungs burned as I fought to reach the surface, but there was no surface anymore. Only endless darkness in all directions. Then I saw her. Ma mère wasn't human and never had been. She was vast, ancient, a thing of tentacles and teeth that had learned to mimic human form. Her true body lay buried in the deepest part of the swamp, in chambers that predated human civilization. What we'd been fighting were just extensions of her will, fingers of a hand we'd never seen. Around her true form, thousands of bodies floated in perfect preservation. Her collection of souls spanning centuries, all the missing people, all the unexplained disappearances. They hung in the dark water like ornaments, their eyes open but empty. But Sarah's song had reached even here. Some of the preserved bodies began to stir, remembering life, remembering themselves. The woman's hold on them was weakening. I felt Tommy's hand grab my arm, pulling me upward. Somehow, we broke the surface of real water. Not the supernatural depths where ma mère dwelled, but the actual Atchafalaya Basin. We gasped and flailed, treading water in a normal Louisiana swamp channel. Sarah was there, still singing despite having nearly drowned. Tommy supported her while scanning for solid ground. There, he pointed to a genuine island covered with healthy cypress trees and Spanish moss. We swam toward it with desperate strokes. Behind us, the water exploded upward as something massive reached the surface. I caught a glimpse of writhing tentacles, each one thick as a tree trunk, and eyes the size of dinner plates that burned with malevolent intelligence. Ma mère was rising. We reached the island and scrambled onto dry land just as the entity's true form emerged from the depths. She was even more horrifying in full daylight, a creature that belonged in the deepest ocean trenches, not a Louisiana swamp. Her tentacles lashed at the water, sending waves crashing against our refuge. But something was wrong with her. The clear water burned her like acid, and patches of her dark flesh were already beginning to dissolve. Sarah's song had done more than free some of her victims. It had purified the water itself, turning her own domain against her. She can't survive in clean water, Tommy realized. The corruption was protecting her. More of ma mère's victims broke free, rising from the depths as the entity's control weakened. Jake and David surfaced near our island, coughing up black water but breathing, alive themselves again. "Marcus," Jake called, his own voice restored. "Sarah, thank God you're alive." We helped pull them onto the island. Both men were pale and traumatized, but they were human again. Around us, other souls freed from ma mère's control swam toward shore or simply dissolved into light, finally able to pass on after decades of imprisonment. The ancient entity gave one final, ear-splitting shriek before sinking back into the depths. But the water continued to clear, and I knew she wouldn't be able to return to the surface. The purification was spreading throughout the swamp, undoing centuries of supernatural corruption. "Is it over?" David asked, still shaking from his ordeal. "For now," Tommy said. "But places like this, they remember. Best we leave and don't come back." We spent that night on the island, too exhausted to do anything but rest. The next morning, a real search and rescue team found us. Apparently, Sarah's company had reported us overdue when we failed to check in. The official report listed us as survivors of a boating accident. Jake and David were treated for exposure and mild hypothermia, with no memory of their time under ma mère's control. The authorities found no trace of Boudreaux or his boat, just another unsolved disappearance in the vast Atchafalaya Basin. But Tommy and I remembered everything, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear that ancient voice calling from deep water. "Come home to ma mère." The swamp is cleaner now, healthier. Tourist boats run regular routes through channels that were once forbidden. Fishermen report better catches and clearer water. The Atchafalaya Basin is slowly healing from wounds that date back to prehistoric times, but I never go near the water anymore. And when people ask me about camping, I tell them to stick to the mountains. Some wilderness should remain wild, some depths should never be disturbed, and some hungers are old enough to remember when the world was young and darkness ruled the deep places of the earth. Sarah still works for the same company, but she's never organized another team-building retreat. Jake transferred to a different department and won't talk about Louisiana. David left the company entirely and moved to Arizona, as far from swampland as he could get. Only Tommy remained unchanged. He still guides fishing trips through the Atchafalaya, but he's careful about where he takes clients. There are channels he won't enter, islands he won't approach, depths he won't sound. Some places remember, he told me the last time we spoke, and some things are better left sleeping. I think about that conversation every time I see a body of water, every time I hear voices calling across the dark, every time I remember the feeling of something vast and hungry stirring in the depths below. The nightmares have faded, but they haven't disappeared. In my dreams, I'm still standing on that shrinking island, watching shapes move beneath black water, still hearing ma mère's voice promising an end to loneliness, an end to pain, an end to everything human, still remembering that some hungers are older than civilization, and some appetites can never truly be satisfied. The Atchafalaya Basin covers 1.4 million acres of Louisiana wilderness. Every year, people go missing in its depths, boats vanish, experienced guides lose their way, bodies are never found. The official explanation is always the same: accidents, exposure, alligators, the hazards of wild places. But Tommy knows better, and now so do I. Ma mère is sleeping again, deep in the purified waters where light can't reach. But sleep isn't death, and hunger doesn't die just because it's been denied. She's waiting. She's always waiting. And sometimes when the moon is dark and the water is still, she still calls to those foolish enough to venture too deep into the places where the civilized world ends and older rules apply. The swamp remembers, and so do I.